Okay, everyone. Well, I think this is all we've got for tonight. So this is awesome. Great to see six of you here to get things started as we do a little bit of training for you. So thank you for taking time out on your Wednesday evening to attend a little pivot table training. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Scott Kinsella. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I don't actually work for Microsoft. That's just my certification. And I've been teaching these Microsoft products for well over 2 decades now. And as part of just things that I like to do, I did these a few years ago and finally just decided to start doing these again. And so hopefully we'll make this an every week or maybe every other week sort of deal. So based on the popular response I got on Facebook for what courses to do first or what course to do first, tonight we're going to do Excel pivot tables. In the many, many years that I have been teaching, I can tell you that this is always the most popular topic that people seem to want. I don't know what it is about them. Well, I do. It's just that they are such an amazing tool for analyzing stuff in Excel. This will be part of a series of classes that I'll do on pivot tables. This is the basics class. At some point, I also hope to offer you the kind of intermediate and the advanced class on these as well. As I've mentioned, and I'm going to paste it one more time into the chat window, there is a link to my OneDrive for Business in the chat window. You can click that. That's going to take you to a public folder. In there right now, all you'll see is one folder for the Excel pivot tables class. And in there, you'll see a PDF with the slides and a few sample files. As I do more of these classes, I'll be adding more content to that same folder. So you may want to bookmark that site, bookmark that place, and come back in the future to see what other sorts of stuff I have posted there. Ground rules, everybody's muted. That way we don't get a lot of background noise and everything else. So if you do have a question, please just type it in the conversation IM chat window that's there in Skype for Business, and I'll certainly answer it. Try to keep my eye on the, even though it's on a different monitor, try to keep my eye on the questions as they come up. Additionally, this will be posted to YouTube either today or tomorrow at some point. So if you want to review parts of this training, or you want to share my YouTube channel with other folks, you can do that. I will post a link to that on Facebook as to where that channel is, or you can just go to YouTube and search for my name and you'll find my channel that's there. So with all of that preamble out of the way, let's get started with tonight's topic, and that is Excel working with pivot tables. All right, so let me move over here. There we go. So there I am. Of course, you can see me on the video as well, but the video is not going to be included with the actual YouTube training. Basically, like I mentioned, I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I've been teaching this stuff for 22 years, well, over 22 years actually. I live in Rockville, Maryland. You can see my website is posted there, just my professional site. And again, if you want to find my YouTube channel with some older videos that are there, and as we add new ones, just go to YouTube and search for my name. You'll find it there. So what do we want to talk about in this 90-minute-ish session that we've got tonight on pivot tables? Well, this one is kind of organized like a bunch of questions. And what we want to first look at, and I'm a huge believer in the basics. One way I could approach this class is literally just kind of tell you that pivot tables are cool, jump right into Excel and start showing you how to do them in Excel. I don't think that's a good idea. And in all the years that I've taught this, that's never been a good idea, because what I think's really important, and this is what we're going to spend a good chunk of time on, is actually understanding how you need to set up your data first before you try to create a pivot table. I think one of the reasons why people have trouble with pivot tables, or they think they're off-putting, is they don't do the preparation steps. Those of you who know me, I like to use a lot of food analogies when I'm talking in my training. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I watch Food Network a lot. But it just so happens that especially with pivot tables, you've got to do the mise en place. You've got to do your prep work. And if you don't do the prep work, you're not gonna get the right results. You're gonna have a really difficult time trying to create a pivot table. So what we want to look at is we want to look at what is a pivot table first. What can you do with them? What's so great about them? How do you get started? How should the data look? how should the data be organized, and then we've got some other things towards the end. Okay, so again, the first part of what we're going to do here is going to be kind of lecture, and that's because I think understanding these fundamentals is going to make your pivot table experience that much better moving forward. So first off, what is a pivot table? Well, here is the long, wordy definition that comes from Microsoft that basically says a pivot table is a yada, yada, yada. You can read the slide. The funny side of why it's called a pivot table is it's literally a term that Microsoft could trademark. Calling it a crosstab query, which is kind of the common name for it, is not something that they could trademark. So basically, back when Microsoft added this feature to Excel many years ago, they essentially said, well, we want to call it something that we can trademark and sell it as a feature. So they came up with the name pivot table. Now you'll see it actually has some relevance. You'll be able to see when we get in to start working with pivot tables that there's kind of a reason that they're called that you can literally pivot the information around itself. Okay, so the pivot table itself, in generic terms, is something we would call a crosstab query, and that comes from the database realm. All right, well, let's make it a little more realistic. What are some of the things that we can do with a pivot table? Well, there's lots of things that we can do. And, these little 5 bullet points that I put here really are just the tip of the iceberg at best. But we can create frequency distributions. We can do cross tabulations of data. Again, that's coming directly from the database world. We can display subtotals of groups, and we can also dive in and look at more detail. We can rearrange the information in lots and lots of different ways. Okay, we can also, in the advanced sections, we're not going to do this here, you can start to use the information in a pivot table into special formulas and calculations. We won't get into that today, but in other sessions we will. And we can create groupings of summary items. Now, again, a lot of this you might still be scratching your head going, I don't understand all that. Don't worry, we're getting to the good stuff. So that being said, we can do a lot of data analysis with pivot tables. Well, okay, that's great, Scott, but what's so great about the pivot tables themselves? What makes this feature just that interesting? Well, first off, one of the really cool things about pivot tables is they don't require writing any formulas. You can literally create very powerful data analyses and not write one single formula. Okay, my mom can do a pivot table. I think I taught her, or I set one up for her. But the nice thing about it is that you don't really have to do anything complicated to come up with a pretty thorough analysis of your data. Pivot tables can crunch large amounts of data in mere seconds. You can have thousands and thousands of rows of data, and the pivot table can literally crunch that and come up with a report in seconds. That's that's also very cool about it. It's easy to shift and change the report. This is where the term pivot really comes from, is that it's very easy once you've got the first few steps done to rearrange it and change it around and go, well, I'd really like to look at the data this way, or I'd really like to do that. You can change to your heart's content and not worry about screwing up the original data list. That's what's another thing that's very cool here. You can also use pivot tables to analyze a set of data multiple ways. So I may have a single list of data, but I can analyze that data as many different ways as I want. I can slice it and dice it and create different reports, all based on that same information to reflect different things as I feel like. Oh, and did I mention no formulas are required? It's a little snarky, but to me, that's truly what's great about a pivot table, is that you don't have to know the first thing about writing sum formulas or averages or subtotals or any of the myriad functions that are in Excel. You can simply just create lots of great data analysis without a whole lot of work. And that, to me, is what's so great about it. So how do we get started? All right, what do we need to do to create a pivot table? Now, again, we could have just dove in and click on the pivot table button and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't understand the fundamentals of what's going on, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm very keen to for my students to understand the fundamentals. So before we start analyzing data with a pivot table, we need to make sure that our data is organized correctly. Okay, there is a right way and definitely a lot of wrong ways to set up your information so that you can make a pivot table out of that. To talk in database terms, a pivot table requires that your data list be in the form of something we would call a rectangular or a flat file database. Now, I don't know how many of you know what those are. You don't need to worry about the terminology. Um, Essentially, what we need is a very simple list. Okay, we'll go more details. Now, this third point is the one we're going to have to spend a good chunk of time on, and we have to understand that the data must also be normalized. Now, again, if you've got database experience, you might recognize that word. If you don't, this is a whole foreign concept to you, so we're definitely going to talk about that. Yeah, what? What is all this stuff? All right, so in order to accomplish this stuff as far as the get started, let's tackle it from two angles. One, how should the data look? And two, how should the data be organized? I know it kind of sounds like the same thing, but it's actually different stuff. So let's open up a spreadsheet and let's take a look at this. All right. So this is the spreadsheet. I just opened up the wrong file. Let's try that again. Normalized data. There we go. That's the one I want, not the guest list for my parents' anniversary party. All right. So here is a list of data. And what we want to do is we want to take a look at how this is set up. First off, looking at our PowerPoint, we want in our data that we're going to use, that we're going to analyze, the first thing that we want is the first row of data needs to be labeled headings. So looking here, you can see we've got well-labeled headings on each of these columns. Okay, state, region, month, quarter, and sales, all set up very nicely. First row doesn't have to be the first row of the spreadsheet, but definitely helpful if it is, because honestly, this is just going to be the sheet where the data is located. So we don't need to worry about how it looks. All right, we'll get more into that in just a second. Like, we don't have to make it pretty. We don't have to really get obsessed about the order of the data either. It's not really going to matter. Okay, next, each column of data is consistent. So what we mean by that is if you've got a numeric column, you should have numbers down the entire column. A single text value in any cell in a numeric column is going to mess things up. So here's what we're talking about. In looking at this data that's here, all right, I've got most of these columns are text except this sales column. These are actually numbers, and they are numbers all the way down. What you don't want to have is any cell that might say something like NA or unknown, okay, or to be decided or something like that. You do not want to have any text values. If you don't know a number, just leave it blank or put in a 0. But don't write TBA, unknown, NA. Don't put any text there. That's going to cause an issue. All right, let's go back to what we had here, 1,118. Okay. This is also true for date columns, time columns, currency, anything that's a type of number. You definitely need to make sure it's in the same format all the way down. Okay, and that if it's all dates, you don't have one of them that says unknown or unsure or NA or something like that. If it's a column that's supposed to be dates, make it all dates. If it's a column that's supposed to be all times, make it times, so on and so forth. Text is really flexible, okay? We can have anything in text columns, it doesn't really matter. But the other stuff, especially with numbers, you gotta make sure they're all formatted correctly. Next, we want to make sure that there are no blank rows or columns in our data list. What we mean by that is don't have that. Okay, we don't want to have a blank column here. That's going to cause a problem. And more commonly, what you don't want to do, and this is what sometimes people do in their data lists, is that we don't want to have a situation where maybe each group of data I've inserted a blank row. Don't do that. That's really bad. That's going to cause problems with the analysis. It's also going to cause problems in some of the first steps when we try to create the pivot table because Excel might not pick up on all that information. Excel generally, when it's looking for what information to pick up, goes until it sees a blank line. So we don't want any blank lines here. All right. So no blank rows, no blank columns. Now notice I said columns and rows. A blank cell is okay. All right. If I don't know something, for instance, if I don't know this sales number and I leave it blank, that's okay. All right. That's not going to hurt anything. But what will be bad is if the whole row was blank or the whole column was blank. Okay. Even if I have one value, if I only know California here for some reason, the rest of this can be blank and this is still okay. But you don't want to have an entirely blank row. Okay. All right. Lastly, formatting doesn't hurt anything, but it's definitely not necessary. So when you're looking at this list here, you can see there's no lines, there's no bold. The only place that any formatting has been added is up along the top here, okay, where the headings are. All right, we threw in a little bold and we threw in a little color, but honestly, that's not even really needed. You can do it yourself if you want, just to add some stuff there. But otherwise, don't get into lines, don't get into colors, don't get into any of that sort of business. You're absolutely wasting your time if you're doing that. Okay? All right, so to quick review from how the data should look. First row of data is labeled headings. Each column of data is consistent. We have no blank rows or columns. Formatting doesn't hurt anything, but it's not necessary. All right, now let's go on to the hard part. And that is, how should the data be organized? Well, first off, and this is one that's going to make people a little uncomfortable, that is the order of the data does not matter. Sure, as humans, we like to have the stuff that we have here in some sort of semblance of an order that looks nice. The reality is, it doesn't make any difference. Okay, it's nice that the Californias are together here and the Washingtons and so on and so forth, but they don't have to be. And a matter of fact, if I'm going to add more data later, don't do things like inserting rows and then putting, the rest of the California data right here. You know what? Just put it at the end. Okay, the order here doesn't matter. Okay, this doesn't need to be pretty. This is just your data. Will make it pretty in the pivot table later. Okay, so the order does not matter here. Now, this is the hard part, and this is where that funny word normalization comes into play. Each row of data in my list should only contain one data point. Okay, this one is going to take a little work to wrap our head around. This is, again, what we mean by normalization, is that every row in the list that I've got here should describe a single data point. So let's come back over here and look. Yes, I've got 5 columns of information, but all 5 of these pieces describe one data point. And essentially in this list, they're describing the sales. There was this many sales. It was the first quarter of February for the West region for California, which is in the West region. Okay, all of this information describes a single piece of data. Okay, is it making a little sense? Maybe, maybe not. So let's look at an example where it's not set up correctly. So here's an example. And this is generally a type of example that people do think makes for a good pivot table, but there's a problem. So look at the information that we've got here. Now this looks really nice. This looks like it's set up pretty well. Looks like there's consistent information. We got numbers in number columns, and we've got some headings up along the top and all that other sort of stuff. But in looking at this information, and what we've got here, there are some definite problems. So for those of you who are on, here's our audience participation time. what looks like it's potentially an issue here with what I've got displayed on my screen. Let me blow it up just a little bit more. Why is this not a good setup for a list that we would then turn into a pivot table? What's one of the things that's wrong here? There's a couple of things that are problematic. Totals in the middle rows or subtotals. Yeah, that's certainly a problem, Christy. Yep, absolutely. We don't like that. Yeah, we don't want to have any formulas that are already in here. Yeah, there's some totals here, so that those don't belong. And then we've also got some formulas here that are issues. So yeah, that's a good one. All right, that's one. What's the other one? And this is the point that we just talked about. What's wrong with this, with what our setup is here? Anybody notice it? Well, let's look at this data. Let's look at this right here. Ignoring the quarter one, quarter two, and totals, how many data points do I actually have here in that California row? Is it one data point or is it more? How many data points are there? Anyone? There's 6. Yeah, thank you, Trish. Yep, there's 6 data points here, and that's a problem. Sure, we've got a data point. Now, what I don't want you to equate is don't equate data points with numbers. That's a bad thing. We'll dive into that a little bit more. But to really explain it, when looking here, all right, we've got this number here, which is actually the January sales for California. Then we got this number here, which is the February sales for California, and so on and so forth, okay? So these, every one of these numbers is an individual data point. Usually one of the dead giveaways that your column headings are incorrect is that you have items up here instead of groups. What do you mean by that? For instance, this says state. That's a group. And below that, we've got the actual individual states. But this right here, is that an item? Is that an item or is that a group? When I look at that first column heading there in B1, which I have highlighted right now, is January an item or is January potentially part of a group? Basically, based on what I see here. Is it a group or is it an item? Well, it's an item, okay? January, February, and March are all items. So really what I should have is a column called month. Look at that over here. And then we list the individual months. All right, we'd have the same problem if I had regions listed up here and I had East, West, and Central. So that's another usually key thing to look for in going, are my columns correct? Because right here, this looks like it's okay. But it's actually not, because these are individual items that could be part of a group. And if you start seeing that, that's usually a dead giveaway that something isn't normalized. So this, if you'll notice, this sheet called not normalized and this sheet normalized are the same data. It's just that this one is set up correctly with all the data as it should look. Okay, so you can see here that every one of these California numbers actually takes up 6 rows now. Right? Because we've got all 6 of these. And don't worry about these quarters and totals. We'll come up with that stuff later in the pivot table itself. Okay, but this is definitely not a good setup. This is. So let's refine that a little more. There can be lots of fields and columns for a row, but each descriptor should be describing a single point of data. Okay, again, this is not, looking here at the normalized sheet, this is not 5 points of data. This is a single point of data that's being described by 5 things. We could have lots more columns here. I could have the actual salesperson. I could have the date of the sales. There could be lots of other things here. But as long as every additional column is still describing what is potentially one data point, you're okay. All right. What I wouldn't want to have is maybe another column here called sales. I wouldn't want to have the first day's sales and the second day's sales and the fourth, the first, I wouldn't want the days of the months across the top here. That would be a problem. Okay. Here's another way to kind of think about what it means to normalize, or what's all part of one data point. Your address, we call that a single thing, your mailing address. But your mailing address is made up of lots of individual parts. Your title, your name, your middle initial, last name, street number, street name, street designation, all that sort of stuff. There's all these little bits and pieces, but they all make up one address. Okay? That's another way to try to think of normalization, is that we have to make sure in the data that we want to turn into a pivot table that it's normalized data. Okay? This is going to take some practice, and I could spend an entire hour on this, but I don't want to do that. Don't want to punish you all that way. But this is the little crash course in normalization, is that I really want to have my data so that every row here just describes one point. That's really, really important. Otherwise, when you go to do your pivot table or you try to analyze things, you're going to run into issues. Okay? By the way, at any point, if any of y'all have questions, please just type it in the chat window. I'll see it pop up here on my other monitor, and I'll be more than happy to try to address that. Okay. So, is there anything else you should do as part of the prep steps? Yes, but I don't want to cover it yet. There's a reason why. There's a method to my madness here. So there is one additional optional step that you should take in your prep work over here. But I want to do I want to do an example first, and then you'll see why that step is so important. Okay. So let's come over to our normalized data workbook that we got here, and let's start to make some pivot table out of this. So I'm on again, I've got the normalized data spreadsheet open. Again, if you've got that open and you're looking at it, you'll see that there is the not normalized tab, which this looks nice, but this doesn't make a good pivot table. And I think this is why people run into problems, is they take this and they start trying to create a pivot table out of this, and then it doesn't work and they don't understand what's going on. Well, hopefully now I've explained to you why that doesn't work. So I'm going to start off with this normalized data here. And we find pivot tables in an odd sort of spot. They're found on the Insert tab of Excel. By the way, if you're not using the same version of Excel that I am, I'm on Excel. I'm using the Office 365 most current version, Office 2019, blah, blah, blah. Everything will be in pretty much the same location-ish. The procedures are all the same, even if your buttons look a little bit different. Okay, so on the Insert tab, what we want to start off with is right here where it says Pivot Table. So I need to make sure that I'm clicked somewhere inside that data. Doesn't matter where. You can be on cell A1, you can be anywhere in the data set, just don't be out over here. Okay, so I'm just going to click on the data set and I'm going to go Pivot Table. Now, some of you might go, wait a minute, Scott, there's that beautiful recommended Pivot Tables button. Avoid that. Until you know more about how pivot tables work and you get through the stuff that we're doing today, I wouldn't recommend that. I'm not a big fan of that. It's nice to let Excel do all the work for you, but if you don't understand how it was done, it becomes a little harder to kind of make sure you do it right the next time. At least that's my opinion. So let's go hardcore and let's go right for the pivot table button. Okay. So the first thing Excel wants to know is, where is the data that you want to analyze to turn into a pivot table? And generally, if you've clicked on the list somewhere and you've set it up right so that there's no blank columns or rows, it's going to make a correct guess here. So notice it says on the select table or range, it says normalized, which is just the name of the sheet, and then it's got the range of cells, and it says A1 to E79. But that range is written a certain way. What is all that extra gobbledygook in there, and what does that mean? Notice that the range is written $A, $1, $E, $79. What does that mean? What's with the dollar signs? Who knows what that is? Why is it not just A1 to E79? What's with the dollar signs in there? Anybody know? I see somebody typing. All inclusive. No, you're close on. It's not inclusive. Any other guesses from the other folks that are on? All right, quick crash course here. There are two types of ways to refer to cells in Excel. One of them is to use something called a relative reference, and the other one is called using an absolute reference. 99% of the time, you're using relative references. And that means that if you copy and paste a formula or you move something around, Excel is going to adjust what you wrote for you, and that's part of the magic. That's why that should happen. But sometimes you want to stay locked to a particular cell or locked to a particular group, no matter where you copy and paste something to. And in those cases, we need something called an absolute reference. Absolute references are also used by Excel in lots of other places, and this happens to be another one of them. And absolute references are designated with dollar signs. So if you notice here, A1, $A, $1, colon, $E, $79 means that is a locked range. That's the only range that Excel is going to analyze and use for the pivot table. This is important. I'm foreshadowing something here. So this is an important thing that's the only range of data that Excel is going to analyze. Okay? All right. The second part of this, so we've got our data that we want to analyze. It guessed correctly, so we're cool with that. And now, where do we want to put our pivot table? You're always going to put it on a new sheet. Well, I'm sorry, not always. Most of the time, it's going to be a new sheet unless you have another blank sheet that you already want to use, and then you could say existing worksheet. Never, ever, ever, never, ever, never place the pivot table on the same sheet as the data list. It's not going to break anything, but as you're going to see, it's just not a good idea. And you'll see why as we get through that. Okay? All right, we're not going to worry about this third thing down here. That is for the graduate level pivot tables. So we're not even going to worry about what data models are at this point in time. So I'm just going to click OK here. And here we go. So now I get a brand new sheet in my workbook and a couple of things show up for me. First off, over on the left, we've got the PivotTable Builder. Okay, our little placeholder for where our pivot table is going to end up. But more importantly, over here on the right-hand side of the screen is where we're going to build up and move and put our pivot table fields to create our pivot table. So looking in the top section here, you'll see that first off, we've got a list of the fields. These names here are our column names from over here. Okay, so whatever I put here is what's going to end up over here. Okay. Short names are best. There's not really, you don't want to have something that's really long like a sentence, but you also don't have to have, really short things. Like I didn't make this file, but they instead of writing the word quarter, they abbreviated it QTR. You don't really need to do that. We could have written the word quarter there and it wouldn't be a big deal. But be mindful of what you name your columns, because especially when we get into intermediate and advanced things with pivot tables, shorter-ish is better-ish, okay? All right. Now, the next thing we have is what's below that, and that is, this is where we're going to build the pivot table. Basically, what you do is you take the fields that are listed up here and you drag them to one of these four sections down below. So we've got a filters section, columns, rows, and values. For our work today, we're going to completely ignore filters. We'll talk more about that later and also a lot more in the intermediate class. So we're just going to concern ourselves right now with columns, values, and rows. At a minimum, you need at least one row or one column and some sort of value in order to come up with any sort of pivot table that makes sense. Now, most pivot tables are going to have something in the columns and something in the rows, but you don't have to have both. At a minimum, though, you have to have one or the other. And you always have to have something in the values section, because that's where we're doing our analysis. Because basically columns and rows is where the labels are going to end up, and values is where the mathematics and magic happen. Okay, where we count things or sum them up or do averages or any of that sort of stuff, that's going to happen in the values section. Okay, so let's start to build our first basic pivot table. So let me take state and put that in the rows. And immediately when I do that, notice that we've got something happening over here already. You'll notice that the states that Excel found are already listed here. By the way, little sneak trick. Pivot tables often can be great for proofreading. If somebody had mistyped the word California or Massachusetts, that would immediately show up here as a second entry. So this is especially valuable for, abbreviations or words that might not be in the dictionary. So if you spell check, it doesn't necessarily work properly. A pivot table can actually be a little side trick for checking on consistency. For instance, maybe somebody writes department of something and abbreviates it and another person doesn't. This is a way to kind of clean that stuff up. Okay, let's throw in another field. Let's put the months across the top. Okay, that's looking pretty decent. So we've got our states down the side and we've got our months along the top. And now we need something to analyze. So what makes the most sense in our basic pivot tables? Well, only one of our columns was numbers. So let's start off with the sales. So I'm going to take sales, I'm going to drop that on the values. And voila, we've got something already. That quickly, as I drop something on there, I've got some analysis. I've got some numbers going on. Let me zoom in a bit so you can see this a little better. There we go. Oops, one more. Okay, that's lovely. All right, now the temptation might be to go, okay, I'm done, but there are some things that we definitely want to do to make this look better, okay? First off is one of my major pet peeves with pivot tables, and that is that they're entered in a certain layout. Oh, don't worry about the pound signs, we'll fix that in a second. There are three potential layouts for pivot tables that Microsoft has created. One is called compact, another one is called tabular, and another one is called outline. The compact layout is the default, and there's no way to change that. It's always that any pivot table you create is always going to start off in the compact layout. The problem is, and this is totally my opinion, the compact layout is the worst of the three, okay, for a variety of reasons. So what I'm going to do is that now that I've got my pivot table, looking up in my ribbon, there's a tab up here that's called Design. It's right next to the PivotTable Analyze. And I'm going to click on that Design tab. And here is the button that says Report Layout. And here are the three layouts I talked about: compact, outline, and tabular. In my humble opinion, the compact form is the worst form, and unfortunately that's always the default. There's no way to change that to one of the others. I would highly recommend that as soon as you create your pivot table, change to either outline or tabular. Right now, they're both going to look the same. Until we do more complicated pivot tables, then you'd see a difference between the outline and the tabular styles. But right now, because we still have a very basic pivot table, they're both going to look exactly the same. So I'm just going to choose show in outline form. Now already this looks better, because if you'll notice, Excel made all the columns the same widths, and notice this right here. Before, this said row labels and column labels, which I think is really clunky. And now it's actually put the names of the fields there, state and month. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. So now we've got that there. All right, now there's still other things that we could clean up here. So from the assembled crowd that's here, what is something that we'd like to maybe change or make look better on this pivot table? How can we make this look a little better? Any suggestions? All right, fine, I'll make the suggestion. Well, I don't like these numbers. And these are all sales numbers, aren't they? So let's make them look like sales numbers. Now, there's something I want you to notice. Look at these numbers and notice how plain they are. Let's go back over to the data list, and I want you to notice something. Look at the difference between the sales numbers here versus what ends up in the pivot table. What's the difference here? Anybody see it? Yeah, notice that the commas are missing. The more general point I want to make is this. If your numbers over here have any kind of formatting applied, whether it's currency or commas or percentages or any of that sort of stuff, formatting gets lost when you do the pivot table. So notice this number format with commas does not come over. All right? Which means we've got to put it back on there. And as a matter of fact, what I'd really like to do is do this with dollar signs. So what you don't want to do is don't try to come over here and go, all right, well, let's make this all currency. The problem is it's still going to end up looking like this. Okay, so the question is, how do we do it? Well, most of you might be tempted to, like we would normally format things, we would be tempted to come in, highlight all these cells, and then apply a format, right? But there's a problem with that. What could potentially be the problem? Well, this is where we get into the whole idea of a pivot table being able to pivot. Look at this table right now, and I want you to notice that it's taking up from A3 to H18. That's its current layout. I'm going to switch some stuff. I'm going to come over here to my pivot table fields pane, and I'm going to put the month in the rows section, and I'm going to put the state in the columns. This happens to be why it's called a pivot table, or one of the reasons why, because I can easily pivot and change the layout of the table. Notice now where my table, what space it takes up. Now, instead of going from A3 to H18, it's going from A3 to O11. So the layout of the pivot table is different, okay? Or I could do this. This is another type of pivot table. So notice I can move things around. With that in mind, if I just format these cells and then change my pivot table, is that going to affect the formatting? Is the formatting going to carry over, or is it not? What are your thoughts? Well, what'll happen is that if I direct format these cells, the only cells that are going to be formatted are those. So if I highlight right now B5 to H18 and format them, but then maybe I decide I want to change my pivot table layout to something else, well, the cells that aren't in that original box are not going to be highlighted. Or I'm sorry, they're not going to be formatted correctly. Ew. So, we need a different way to get at the formatting for these numbers as opposed to direct formatting. We don't want to direct format these cells. We need to find another way. And that is hiding over here in the values section where it says right now, sum of sales. If you notice, each one of these labels that I dragged down from up here and dropped into the field areas down here, each one of these has a drop-down menu with different things that we can alter and do. And right now, I'm going to click on where it says sum of sales. I'm going to click its drop down. And there's a bunch of stuff here, but what I'm concerned about right now is this one here that says value field settings. So I'm going to choose that. Initially, what I'm shown is first off, I can give this value section a different name. Right now, it's calling it sum of sales. I could call it something else if I wanted to. I could change the name. Here's the other thing I want you to notice though. Excel is always, pretty much always when it comes to numbers, is going to default to doing a sum calculation because that's the most common one. The reality is though, you don't have to do a sum if you don't want to. There are lots of other mathematical operations that you could do. You could do a sum, account, an average, max, min, product, and then there's a bunch of statistics-based ones like standard deviation population, so on and so forth. Okay, so we'll play around with this a little bit more later. Where I'm really headed for though is this button right here that says number format. So I'm going to click that button, and does this box look familiar? Now, you all should be saying yes, because if you've used Excel and you've never seen this box, I don't know what you've done. But yeah, look, this is the regular format cells dialog box that we would see. Now we can format the value field as opposed to formatting some cells. Okay. Now, I said I wanted to do this like currency. Another little dirty secret I want to give you. Most of the time when you format something with dollar signs, what you're actually applying is the accounting format, not the currency format. The difference is that the currency format puts the dollar sign right up against the number, regardless of the length of the number. Accounting lines all the dollar signs up on the left side of the cell, regardless of the length of the number. Accounting is the one that generally looks better because all the dollar signs are lined up. So I'm going to choose the accounting format, and I'm going to say OK, and then I'm going to say OK here. And let's zoom out a little bit so we can see what we've got here. Ah, that looks better. Now, all of my numbers are properly formatted with dollar signs, commas, and .00s. Okay, so remember, even if that format was applied over here, it's not going to carry over to the pivot table. So you're always going to have to apply formatting later, which means don't waste your time formatting it over here. Whoever, I did not create this file. Whoever on this sales file even bothered formatting this with commas wasted their time, because that information is not going to come over. So don't waste your time, right? We don't want to waste our time on things that we don't really need to mess around with. Okay? All right. Good so far? All right. Now, we'd still like to make this look a little better, right? We want to add some more formatting here. We want to spruce this up a little bit, but we're going to have the same problem as we did before. Is if I come in here and go, well, maybe I'd like every other row to be shaded, or maybe I want to add, maybe Kentucky needs to be bold, or I don't know. You want to add more, you want to do boxes or lines. You're going to have the same problem here, is that if you ever change the layout of the pivot table, your formatting is going to be in the wrong place. Notice right now, I can rearrange this pivot table however I want. Notice the numbers are staying formatted. They're staying formatted because I formatted the field, not the cells. So no matter where I drag my fields, everything is staying the same way. When it comes to other formatting, we've got the same problem. If you want to add color or lines or any sort of business like that, you're going to run into the same issue. So if you do want to change the look of your pivot table, you've got to do it from the Design tab on the ribbon. When I come up to the Design tab, you'll notice that there is a Pivot Table Styles gallery. And if I drop that down, I can pick from, there are a couple dozen different styles here that use the theme colors that you've currently selected in your workbook, and you can choose any one of these, okay? And then even once you choose them, there are additional options that you can turn on and off up here next to that, where it says pivot table style options. So you can turn certain things like row headers, column headers, banded rows, and so on and so forth on and off to get more of the desired look that you want on your pivot table. Okay, so use this gallery to create your pivot table, to format it, as opposed to trying to do direct formatting. All right. Now, that's a little too much color for me. Let's go here. Let's get rid of banded rows for right now. I'm going to keep it simple for our example right now. Okay? All right. Now, let's talk about the magic of updating our pivot table. So let's come over to this tab here. And let's say that the person from California calls me and says, oh, hey, you know what? This number was not our June sales. It was actually something else. It was more than that. So I am going to, for right now, just so that it's really obvious, I'm going to make this number really huge. Okay, I'm going to make it like, let's make it so we can see it. Okay, so I'm going to make it 250,000. I got a huge number that's there now. So I've updated the number there. And now I'm going to come back over to my pivot table. And when I look at my pivot table, is that number there? Is that 250,000 showing up anywhere? Yes or no? Nope. Yeah, notice it didn't get included. So here's the next thing about pivot tables that we need to know. Pivot tables aren't dynamic. They must be told to refresh themselves. A pivot table is what we call a static report, is that once you generate it, it's going to stay that way and it's not going to do any other calculations until you tell it to go back out and check again. You do have to tell it to go do that, okay? So I need to update this pivot table. So I'm going to go to the PivotTable Analyze tab, and somewhere here in your data group, you're going to see a button here that says Refresh. So that is going to force this pivot table to go back out to the list and kind of recompute everything. So let's do that. Aha! Now that number shows up. Now we're cooking with gas here, all right? The number shows up. It did a refresh. By the way, when we get into more advanced stuff in other sessions, if you've got multiple pivot tables that are analyzing the same set of data, when you refresh one, that will refresh all of them. So you don't have to worry about going from pivot table to pivot table. Okay? All right, let me change this back to a small number. I think it was like 16, 18 or something like that. Now again, notice I just changed it, but notice it doesn't change over here. So I've got to go to Analyze, refresh to get it back the way it was. Okay. Now, let's say I didn't change data, but I want to add some data. Okay, I want to add more data to my list. And we're going to add something for California. Now, first off, don't come in here and insert a row between California and Washington to add another row. You're wasting your time. Okay, that's too much effort. Remember, over here in our data list, the order of the data doesn't matter. Okay, that's really irrelevant to what we're doing here. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to come down to the end here and I'm going to type in California. Excel is auto-filling some stuff for me. And let's start doing the next quarter. So I'll do July. Let's do QTR3. And let's say they had a really good month. Let's give them 2,000, whatever that means. Okay. And while we're at it, let's add one for Kansas. Kansas is in the central region. We'll also do July, QTR3, and we'll give them some good sales as well. Okay. So now I've added a couple more rows of data down there at the bottom. Remember, it doesn't have to be in order. The order doesn't matter. I just go ahead and I'm going to stick it there at the end. So I'm going to come over to my pivot table. I'm going to click here. What am I going to do? I'm going to click refresh, right? Pivot table analyze, click refresh, and what happened? I clicked refresh. Huh. I wonder what's wrong here, he says with a tone, knowing fully well that he did something wrong, that he did something, but he did it on purpose. What's wrong? Anybody know? And it was something I told you to pay attention to earlier. Oh, I see some people typing. Aha, Julianne's got it. Yeah, well, Christy says there's no quarter 3 months. Yeah, they're not showing up, but why is that? And Julianne says we need to change the range. Remember I said pay attention to something, folks? This is foreshadowing. Yeah. Let's come back over to our pivot table and let's analyze what happened here. Remember earlier when I was on here and we created a pivot table, okay? And it Oh, I'm sorry, let's come over here. We were creating the pivot table. I think I can show you. Yes, there we go. And we saw something like this. Remember when I said pay attention to the absolute versus relative. Notice where Excel has defined the range that it's picking up for its pivot table. It's only going to pick up A1 through E79. That's all that we defined. We said those are the rows to analyze. So regardless of the fact that we added a couple more rows here, right? I added more stuff. The thing is, that's in row 80 and row 81. The pivot table was only told to analyze everything down to 79. So no matter how much we keep adding there, the pivot table is just going, hey, you only told me to look to row 79, not any further than that. Okay? So that extra data is not being included. Now there's a couple of ways around this. One of them is that yes, we could come back over to the pivot table. We could go to PivotTable Analyze. You could click this button that I did here where it says Change Data Source. Okay, here it comes. There's the range. And we could expand the range, right? I could say, all right, no, don't go to 79. Go all the way to 81. But why would that be a bad idea? Especially with this type of setup that I've got here. I could go in here and say, all right, now look to row 81. But why would that be a bad idea? Jack's typing. Christie's typing. Why would that be a bad idea? You'll need to expand the range again. Thank you, Jack. You nailed it. Sure. Now, I could maybe say, well, make the range all the way to row 1000. All right, you could do that, but that could also cause some problems. All right. So what we don't want to do is get into this business of constantly having to expand the range, because you know what's going to happen. Sometime you're going to forget. All right. So there's a better way to do this. There's a better way to do all of this. So let's cancel out of here and let's come back to our normalized sheet and let's do this differently. Remember in the PowerPoint, we stopped here and I said there's another optional step you might want to take, but let's do some examples first so you understand why this additional step is important or valuable. So now let's see that additional step and why it's important or valuable. Oh, I got my slides out of order. So what's that additional step? Well, when we were doing all that mise en place earlier, remember I was talking about, all right, make sure you've got your column headings and your column row, you got column headings, your columns are consistent, right? That was all the way back here on these slides, right? First row of data is labeled headings. We got consistent data. We got no blank rows or columns. And then how should our data be organized? The order doesn't matter, but we got to make sure it's normalized, yada, 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 right? There's all that stuff. But then there is one more thing that we need to do, or don't have to, but could be very valuable in the long run. And that is taking a step called a data table. And this is where it's going to get confusing because we're going to have data tables, pivot tables, blah, blah, blah. But work with me for a second here. So I'm going to click on my data right here. And I want to make a pivot table out of it. And remember, this is all set up right. We know that the normalized data, we know this is cool. We know this is kosher. It's all set up the way we want it. But before, I'm going to go to the Insert tab. But before I go for this button here where it says, let's make a pivot table, I'm going to go to this button 2 buttons over, and I'm going to select Table. Okay? And what this does is that Excel says, I want to create something called a data table, okay? Just like with the pivot table step, Excel is going to guess the range. And yes, it is written with absolutes right now, okay? Notice, yes, it says $A, $1 to $E, $81, all right? Just work with me. I know where I'm going here, so just trust me. My table has headers. Okay, this is all great. I'm going to say okay. Now, a couple of things happen. Now, all of a sudden, you got all this formatting you don't need. Well, this is, I could do a whole class on data tables, but yes, all this extraneous formatting gets added. If you don't like it, notice you got a new tab up here called Table Design. If you just want to go back to a simple layout, just again, go to the gallery here and just knock it down. I'll do the gray, that's a little easier. But notice you do have a new thing here called Table Design, which adds drop-down menus here, adds this color, and also gives your table a name. Notice right here it says Table 1. All right, well, I'm going to call this Sales Table, all one word. Okay? You don't have to do it that way, but I'm a data geek like that, so I'm going to call this Sales Table. Now, there's something else I want you to look at, and this is going to be hard for me to blow up, but I want you to look at something here. When you have a data table, okay, when you create data tables in Excel, it does a bunch of things for you. And another thing it does is that in the bottom right corner of the data table, unfortunately, there's no way for me to make it bigger, but do you see this little kind of backwards L in that corner? That's what we call the end of table marker. And that tells Excel that's where the end of the table currently is. Okay? Work with me here. Just watch. Okay? We're fine with that, but I want you to notice that. Notice that the end of table marker is now right here in cell E81. Okay? All right. Cool so far. All right, let's make a pivot table quickly. Now, I'm going to come in here. Let's go to Insert. Let's go Pivot Table. Next thing we notice, look at this. Now, where it says select a table or range, what does it say there? Instead of that wonky address that we had before, notice the name of the table is there. Now, this is important. This is really important. We're now defining the pivot table in terms of the data table, not an absolute range. This is important. Trust me, okay? So basically now, the pivot table is going to be based on whatever the sales table is defined as, okay? Or what we're calling sales table. You can call it anything. You can call it junk. Doesn't really matter. All right, all the rest of this is cool. Let's say okay. There we go. Let me throw together a real quick pivot table. Let's throw states, quarters. Let's do the sales. I don't like this layout, so I'm always going to go to design, report layout, show an outline form. All right, let me blow this up so y'all can see what I'm doing. The numbers are wrong. We come down here. Value field settings, number format, accounting, okay, ta-da, there we go. All right, I know I did that all fast, but there's a reason. Okay, so now I'm cool with all of this. Now, let's talk about adding more data. Let's go back to where we ran into the issue before, right? Over here where we ran into the problem where stuff wasn't showing up. This new pivot table that I've created is based on the data table that I created, okay? All right, now let's go back over here and let's go to the end of the list. And I've got this blown up so you can see it. So right now, the data table, which we're calling sales table, is currently defined as A1 to E81, okay? That's the data table definition. Now, it just so happens that data tables can expand automatically. Pivot tables, when they're analyzing their data, don't. Pivot tables are only going to analyze the fixed set of data that you tell it to. But it just so happens that data tables, even though we defined it with an absolute range, Excel is at least smart enough here to go, oh, you're adding more data. You probably want that included in your data table. So if the data table expands, that means the range that the pivot table analyzes is also going to expand automatically. Let's prove it. So let me come here. I'm going to click on row 82. All right. I'm going to start typing Illinois. Okay. Watch. Look at cell. I want you to watch cell E82. All right. You ready? I'm going to move to the next cell. Look at that. automatically Excel has already went, oh, you're adding more data to your data table. Let's expand the definition. So it did. All right, let's throw in July. Let's throw in Q3. Let's give them some sales. All right. And I can keep adding here. Let's do somebody from the East region. Let's do Massachusetts. Massachusetts. Look, all I gotta do is start typing, move to the next cell, boom, it expanded the range again. Okay, that's part of the East region. This was July, Q3, and we'll give them, let's give them 1300 is fine. And for fun, let's do one more. Who else do we want to throw in here? Let's do New York is in the East region. So let's do New York. Once again, look, automatically expanding. Excel is doing that for me. Okay, July, QTR3, and we'll make that 1600. Now, the data table is being updated automatically. The definition of the data table is automatically being updated for me, which means that when I refresh the pivot table, all of this information should be included automatically. And sure enough, when I come over to sheet 2, click on my pivot table, go up to PivotTable Analyze, and click refresh, well, will you look at that? All those numbers get included automatically because the data table range expanded automatically for me. Okay, looks like we got a question coming in. Is there a way to have the region column populate automatically based on the state entered? Not without programming. No, you'd have to get into some VBA type of business with that. Well, not even VBA. You would have to get into something called it's called data validation, and that is an advanced level data validation trick where you would have what are called not connected lists. There's a word for it. It's possible, Jack, but it's not easy. It's kind of an advanced feature that would involve the data validation feature. And basically you would have, cascading, that's the word I was looking for. Cascading, you would have what are called cascading combo boxes. So you'd have to create combo boxes. One would have to be linked to the other, and it's not for the faint of heart. Good question, but yeah. I mean, at least in this case, yeah, do not be sorry that you asked. Questions are always good, all right? If you're worried about people typing in the wrong region, at least know that by way of a pivot table, that would show up pretty quickly. Like if we had the regions in here and you see a state appear in 2 regions, you know immediately there's a problem. So you can easily come back to your list of data and find that very quickly. So I understand you're probably trying to keep people from, putting New York in the central region, but in the grand scheme of things, that would show up pretty fast in a pivot table and would be easily corrected if you spot something like that. So yeah, but excellent question. Okay. So coming back to what we were talking about here, the data table step. So let's come back over here. So that additional step. Now, if you don't, like I said, you don't have to do that step. Personally, I do it every time, no matter what. If you don't want to do it all the time, here's my advice, okay? If you are absolutely sure that the list of data that you're going to analyze is not going to have any new data added to it, then you can pretty easily skip the data table step. Okay, because you're not going to be adding, so you're not going to worry about the range getting any bigger. So the data table step isn't really necessary. If, however, it's a list of data that you could potentially be adding and tacking on and putting additional data there, then you definitely want to do the data table step, because that's going to make your actual pivot table analysis work correctly or work better. Okay, and overall, there are a lot of great benefits to data tables in the first place, even if you do have a fixed list. That's why I always do it. Because if you notice, when you've got a data table here, notice that when I'm scrolling up and down the list, notice up here where the letters would normally be, notice it's now showing the labels. And secondly, notice that you get drop downs automatically that allow you to do things like sorting and filtering without a lot of work. So overall, data tables themselves just have so many cool features that, in my opinion, it's worth that extra time to do that. Okay? All right. Let's come back over to our pivot table over here and let's do some more things with this, even at a basic level. All right. So looking at my pivot table, you'll notice that any field that I've got added to the pivot table, right here in this case where I've got state and quarter, you'll notice that there's a drop down next to those words. And I can click that drop down and hey, we just saw something really similar to this a few moments ago. I can sort any column, or I can sort anything here in my pivot table. So if I want to sort my states the other way around, I just got to go Z to A instead of A to Z. Okay, so I can sort those. Same thing with the quarters. Okay, I can put those in ascending or descending order. You can also filter your items. So for instance, in this pivot table right now, it's showing quarters 1, 2, and 3. But you know what? I don't really have all of the information for the third quarter, so I don't want that showing up in the report that I'm going to give to my boss. So what I can do is on the quarter field right here, I can click the drop down and notice that I've got selection boxes right here. And I can uncheck the one for the third quarter and say, okay. And notice now, the third quarter disappears and all the calculations update as needed. Okay. I could also maybe say, you know what? Let's get rid of New Jersey. Sorry, let's just get rid of New Jersey's numbers. I mean, I know we want to get rid of New Jersey. No, we don't want to get rid of New Jersey. Yes, we do. No, we don't. All right, so I'm going to uncheck New Jersey. And notice now that state doesn't show up. So this is basic filtering, okay? We've got basic sorting and basic filtering that we can do from the fields themselves. So I can come to the drop downs that are here and I can exclude or include any data that I want, okay? So there we go. So we've got some basic sorting and filtering. Let's say that I want to change, what do I want to do? Oh, I want to, let's add some more fields to this. So so far, we've only dealt with having one field in each place. We've had one thing here and one thing here. But the thing is, we can actually have multiple fields in each section. So for instance, I can add region to the rows section and just drop it on there, and I end up with this. Now, ooh, that doesn't look right, does it? Like, well, wait a minute, it's got states, but then it lists the region underneath it. I need it to look the other way. Well, that's fine, that's easy. Just rearrange it over here. Notice it's got by state, then by region. Well, let's just move those around. Let's grab state and put it underneath region. Ah, there we go. That looks better. Now I've got each region at the top, and then all of the states that are in each individual region. And notice that I've got little expand and collapse controls for those. Now that we've got an additional field in our row section or even in the columns section, that's where, remember this, where we went to design and we talked about report layout? This is where we'll start to see a difference between outline form and tabular form. So here's what tabular looks like. Okay, and here is what outline looks like. In outline form, it's putting subtotals up at the top, it's giving some extra space here, and then it's putting all the states below that and so on and so forth. In tabular layout, it's putting the subtotals at the bottom and kind of bumping the states up, and it's a little more, it looks a little different, okay? Now there's still other things that we can turn on and off here. Just hold on, there's other things we're gonna do. I'm going to go with outline form right now. I kind of like that one better. Okay, so we've got outline form. And in this layout section, which we already played with the report layout a little bit, but let's take a look at these other buttons that are here. Let's start with subtotals. The subtotals is irrelevant unless I have a second field here, right? If I take out region, well, there's not going to be any subtotals. There's nothing to subtotal on. We don't have any groupings. So in order to have subtotals in either the row or the column, you've got to have a second field. So let's put region back in here. Okay. Now with the subtotals, I can turn them on or off. Say, well, I don't need to see subtotals. I can turn them off. There, now they're gone. Or I could say show them at the top of the group or the bottom of the group. What makes more sense? All right. There is when they're at the bottom. Here is if they're at the top. This is just personal. This is just your personal preference. What looks best to you? You know, choose what you like. Okay. I happen to be a person that likes my subtotals at the bottom. If you want to put them at the top, that's okay. There's either of those is valid. Next button over, grand totals. By default, yes, a pivot table is going to add a grand total for the row. It's going to do a grand total for the column, and then it's going to have the grand total down there in the bottom corner, okay? Again, we can turn any of that business on or off. We can turn them off completely, okay? Or we can, oops, wrong button. We can say, turn them both on, or maybe I only want to see rows or I only want to see columns. Again, it's all about what you do and don't want to see. I'm going to do on for rows and columns. We already looked at report layout here. Okay. The repeat labels is only if your pivot table is large and you need it to, for instance, maybe your group names get lost on the page. You could repeat you can repeat the labels here. That's essentially what that is. On a small pivot table like this, it looks a little silly. On a larger pivot table, you might need that information. Who knows? Okay. So we could say do not repeat. Yeah, it's a little cleaner that way. Lastly, we've got this one here called blank rows, and it's not quite what you think. If I do blank rows and I say insert a blank line after each item, what that's going to do is it's going to, in this case, insert a blank row. Again, this one only pretty much works when you've got additional groups or subtotals. Notice that it adds a blank line there. So now we've got a pretty good looking pivot table here. All right. And just to show you something really quick, let me do this. Let me get rid of the blank rows. I want to show you something really fast. And let's put month below here. There we go. I think that's about right. Oh, let me zoom out. Okay. This and this look pretty similar, don't they? We've got the states, we've got the subtotals, and we've got months and quarters along the top. So this original thing that we had here that we said was not normalized, we actually ended up creating with a pivot table after all. Okay, it looks a little different, but the reality is this and this are the same deal. Right? We got our states. Here's all their numbers. Here's the quarters. We got subtotals and grand totals and so on and so forth. Oops. We end up with that same thing all over here, pretty much just laid out slightly differently, but also pretty much the same. Cool, huh? All right. Pivot tables, generally we use them for analyzing numbers, but we can also summarize text with them. Let's quickly do another file. Let me open up this employee list. Quickly open up this employee list. Okay. Here is another sort of thing that we want to analyze with a pivot table. Now, in looking at this, yeah, we've got a data table here. We've got, we've got columns with consistent information. But in looking at this, you might go, well, what kind of pivot table could I make out of this? There's no numbers here. Does this even make sense? Well, sure, because remember earlier I showed you that pivot tables not only can do sums, but they can do averages, counts, maximum, minimums. There's all kinds of stuff that they can do. So we can make a pivot table out of this to get information. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to go to insert. We're going to go insert pivot table. All right, see, table one, this is the data table already. Let's put it on a new worksheet and let's say okay. All right, well, what do we want to do? Well, I'd like to know how many employees are at each location. So let's take location and put that in the rows. Okay, there we go. There's our names of locations. And then I got to put something in the values section. Well, now this is where it gets to be a little tricky. And also with text, it becomes interesting. But basically what I can do is that I can take location and put it on the values section again. And notice now it's counting how many employees are in each location. Now, theoretically, I actually could have dropped any field. I did location. I could drop employee. Look, it's the same number, so it doesn't really matter. This just has to do with how text gets counted. All right, let me blow this up so you can see it. Let's change our layout. I hate compact layout. Let's do outline form. There we go. All right. There we go. Now I know how many employees are at each location. And maybe I want to break that down a little further by sex. So let's put that up in the columns section. And there, now I can see from the original information that's here, I can easily see each location, how many males, how many females, and the grand total. Notice there's no sums or averages or anything involved here at all. I simply just, in this case, I'm counting text. So I could pretty much count anything. So when you want to count text, it's best to count things that don't have that have repeating values. So for instance, putting the employee name over here in the row would not have made very much sense because each employee name is similar or is different. We got all different ones. Whereas location and sex kind of makes sense here because we've got repeated different values, repeated values, easy for me to say. So that gives Excel something to count while it's doing to do its thing here. All right. So we can count numbers with that. All right, let's see, where am I at in my examples? I think I am just getting towards where I want here. So let's go back to our slides and let's review some things. I've told you a lot. And yeah, you're probably going to want to watch the recording again later to pick up on a lot of these things. But let's just review some stuff before we kind of close out for the evening. By the way, we'll have plenty of time. I'll stick around and do Q&A. But let's review some things to kind of start to wind things down. First off, look, it is so important when you want to make a pivot table that you organize and normalize your data. This is why people mess up their pivot tables because they don't set up their data list properly. You've really got to do that. If you don't, your pivot table might not work at all. You might not get the results you want. You're going to get frustrated and so on and so forth. So it is so important. That's why I spent so much time on it, is to really organize your data properly and normalize it. You've got to normalize that data. Okay. Secondly, make a data table before a pivot table. If you know you're going to be adding more information to your pivot to your list, make a data table out of that first, base the pivot table on the data table. All right. That's just going to make your life so much easier later. Next, where are you going to put your pivot tables? Look, you always got to put them on new sheets or empty sheets. Based on what we saw, you'll notice that pivot tables, their shape and orientation can change all the time. So it's not a great idea to have more than one pivot table on a sheet. Can you? Sure you can. Should you? I don't recommend it. Unless you're absolutely sure that the 3 pivot tables that you created are never going to change size, that's okay. But if there's any potential that you're going to want to lay them out or do something differently, put them on separate sheets, okay? Next, always change the report layout from compact to either outline or tabular. I know that seems like a fussy step, but trust me, in the long run, you're going to appreciate that step. And unfortunately, there's just no way in Excel to make one of the other layouts the default. I wish they would, but they're not going to. Next, don't format a pivot table directly, okay? Just like we showed with the numbers and with the other formatting, you never want to try to highlight the cells in a pivot table and apply formatting. because if your pivot table changes or you reorient it, the formatting is going to be in the wrong place. So you always want to do indirect formatting. That is, format the values field or use the table styles that Excel is giving you. Later on, I'll show you that's not quite an accurate statement, but for the intro level, let's just keep it simple. Lastly, refresh, refresh, refresh. Don't forget that pivot tables, while they're fantastic and the reports that they generate is very cool, you got to remember that adding data or changing data, a pivot table is not going to refresh itself automatically. It's a static report. It's how it looks at that point in time. So you're going to have to refresh. The nice thing is that if you've got 10 pivot tables that are based on one set of data, if you refresh one, you're going to refresh all of them. So that's an easy sort of thing to do. Or it's easy, that cuts out a fair amount of work. Okay? Anything else? Well, yes. Hey, look, experiment and have fun with this. One of the things I think that's also really cool about pivot tables is that there's nothing that I can do on this table here that's going to mess up this. And that's what's really cool about this. So many people, when they are working with this type of information, and maybe they're putting in subtotals and other sorts of things. The thing is, if you're not careful, you might mess up your subtotals, or you might mess up other formulas or things that are in your data list. The nice thing about a pivot table is that there is absolutely nothing that I can do to this pivot table that is ever going to mess up this sheet. So if you make a mess here or you don't need a pivot table anymore, just delete it. It's really easy. You can make as many as you want, play around. There's no penalty for playing around here. So yeah, there's nothing you can do in a pivot table that's ever going to harm the original data list. So if you make a mess, delete it and start over. It's not the end of the world. It's a very easy thing to do. Okay? Well, that's what I got for tonight. I'll open it up to questions here. Just give me 1 second before we start doing questions. One more time, I want to paste the link to my OneDrive for Business. You can get the slides from this presentation in that link that I just pasted there, as well as there are some sample files. The ones I used here today are also in that folder, so you can download any of that stuff and you can play around with it and enjoy. For future classes, you might want to bookmark that site because that's where I'll be putting additional materials. I'm going to stop the recording right now and then open up to questions. So just give me 1 second. So for those of you who are watching online, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate your attention. Check out my other videos on YouTube, and I hope to see you at